Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Welcome back to Gran Turismo Origins. This is the ongoing series where I'm diving into each of the first 6 mainline GT games. In my opinion, these games define what Gran Turismo is, and yet they all differ from each other in many different ways. These videos are my way of making sense of everything as we fully dissect these games. We're covering pretty much every aspect of them, from the menus and music to the fundamental game design. But not only are we looking back at them retrospectively, we're also considering how they were viewed at the time. By doing all of this, hopefully we can gain a deeper understanding on what makes these games tick and how each of them fits into the broader story of this series. Today, it's time to head into the PS3 era with Gran Turismo 5. Whilst Gran Turismo was an almost instant success from its very first game, really it was on the PlayStation 2 where it was truly able to flex its muscles. The critical and commercial success of both GT3 and GT4 cemented the series as not only the biggest racing game franchise out there, but one of the biggest names in gaming full stop. Of course, with Sony's next console, the PlayStation 3, just around the corner, there was much anticipation for what new heights this could allow the series to reach. But before that, Polyphony had one final game to release on the PS2 in 2006, a new title called Tourist Trophy. Essentially, it was just a stripped-back version of GT4, but with all of the cars replaced with motorbikes. It received middling reviews at the time, but has since become something of a cult favourite. As for the next mainline Gran Turismo game, the first glimpse of this would come at E3 in 2005, with the Vision Gran Turismo trailer. What was shown didn't appear too different from GT4, but the most important takeaway was that it would now be possible to have far more than just 6 cars on track. Official confirmation of Gran Turismo 5 would come just over a year later, with an estimated release date of sometime in 2008. In the meantime, Gran Turismo HD was revealed. The idea was that this game would have taken 2 forms. The first, dubbed GT HD Classic, would have been like an enhanced version of GT4, whereas GT HD Premium would have featured cars and tracks designed specifically for the PS3, with players able to download more as and when they're added. Ultimately, the GT HD project would be killed off before the end of 2006, with focus shifting entirely to the development of GT5. However, a small demo version of the game would be made available by the end of the year, called Gran Turismo HD Concept. This would be the first publicly available Gran Turismo game on the PS3, offering a minor glimpse into the future of the series. It's also notable for being the first title to feature Ferrari, as the brand finally made its long-awaited debut in these games. In July 2007, it was announced that GT5 would be receiving a cut-down prologue version, much in the same way as GT4. This game will release in Japan in late 2007 and the rest of the world in 2008, acting as a showcase for what we would see in the full game. The most important points were of course the much higher quality car models and circuit locations, including a full cockpit view for the first time, and online multiplayer racing. Having missed out on this in the PS2 games, there would be no excuses this time around. As it turned out, GT5 Prologue would end up having a much longer stay than anticipated. As 2007 turned into 2008, it soon became clear that the full GT5 wouldn't be releasing anytime soon. The sheer scope of this game was perhaps even more ambitious than Polyphony had originally realised, but it wouldn't be until E3 2009 that the public would be able to see this. The biggest bombshell was that modelled car damage was finally coming, what was possibly the most requested feature ever since the original Gran Turismo. This trailer also showcased that the game would have the official WRC and NASCAR licenses, and as the months rolled on, even more incredible news would be revealed. Along with Ferrari, Lamborghini would make their first full appearance, and not only would cars be able to receive damage, but thanks to a new physics engine, they could roll over as well. And it didn't stop there, not by a long shot. 3D head tracking, kart racing, dynamic time and weather, over 1,000 total car models, and even a track creator, GT5 just kept getting better and better. But as a result, the wait for it just kept getting longer and longer. This wasn't helped by the fact that Polyphony had other projects as well. Way back at E3 in 2004, Gran Turismo 4 Mobile was announced as a title for Sony's new PlayStation Portable system. In the years after, things went quiet, to the point where most people even considered it as vaporware, but the game was eventually resurrected in 2009 as simply Gran Turismo. In essence, it was GT4, but with a much more streamlined career mode, a few additional cars, and online online features. It reviewed well and went on to become one of the best-selling PSP games ever, but it did still take some development effort away from GT5. Announced in 2006, for an estimated launch in 2008, Gran Turismo 5 would finally release in November 2010. It was a delay that made any of the previous games look like the blink of an eye. But this didn't dampen players' spirits. In fact, it only made them even more expectant. Through the previous 4 games, Gran Turismo had already proven itself beyond any doubt. But with a whole heap of much requested features and additions that had never been seen before, adding up to considerably more content than any other game in the series, GT5 was expected to be not only the best Gran Turismo yet, but the greatest racing game ever made, and by some distance. Yes, it's finally time to dive into the fascinating world of Gran Turismo 5. Another game and another new visual identity. Being developed throughout the late 2000s, it's clear to see how the menus of GT5 represent the aesthetic trends of the time, a style now commonly referred to as Frutiger Aero. Everything has a glossy sheen, marking a noticeable shift from the presentation of GT4 and a whole world apart from GT3 and earlier. Sadly, the theming of the GT mode area as a map is no more, but you can customize this menu with different colors and background images. When it comes to music, take a listen. Yep, Gran Turismo is now firmly in its smooth jazz era. As far as jazz and lounge music goes, it's pretty good, but I've always been a lot more fond of the upbeat stuff when it comes to racing games. Of course, this new style of presentation had already been seen in GT5 Prologue, so it wasn't exactly surprising to see it carry through into the main game. I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of hard for me to listen to this music again with fresh ears, mostly because almost all of it was carried into GT7, to the point where I almost associate it more with that game. This is one of the reasons why I've never been a big fan of games reusing music, even if it is really good. So, onto something Gran Turismo has always been very strong at, the visuals. Well, with GT5, there's a lot to unpack here. The new PS3 quality cars and tracks look exceptional. In fact, I'd almost describe the level of detail on some of these car models as obsessive, especially when you consider their interiors too. But that's just one half of the story. Or more accurately, 2/10. Out of the 1,000 cars in this game, only 200 or so are actually PS3 quality premium models. The other 800 are, well, not that. In a rather disappointing turn of events, the rest are basically just ported over PS2 and PSP models, dubbed as standard cars. Now, whilst this is of course very obvious once you play the game, what's important to consider is that before release, it really wasn't. Whilst this two-tiered approach to the cars in GT5 was known about, all that was stated was that standard cars would have no interiors and less detailed damage. That was it. And given that Polyphony was obviously reluctant to show them off in any pre-release media, this led to something of a backlash at the time when people finally understood the full situation. If you watch my video on standard cars that I made a couple of years ago, you'll know that I don't actually mind them too much, but I do wish they were more upfront about it. It's also worth mentioning that there are some circuits, such as Deep Forest and Trial Mountain, that use noticeably lower quality textures than most others, and can almost be considered as standard tracks. But it's not all bad news. If we once again use Trial Mountain as a point of reference, we can see that the overall visual style of this game is a lot more vibrant than GT4's. Kind of ironic considering that games on 7th generation consoles are often remembered for their washed out and muddy looking colour palettes. With Gran Turismo it's kind of the opposite, with everything having a much brighter look. I still say I prefer the visuals of GT3 thanks to that game's more exaggerated lighting, but at its best, GT5 is still absolutely stunning. Something that we haven't really had to talk about with the previous games is performance, but with GT5 we sadly can't ignore it. Whether it be excessively long loading times, frequently dropped frames, screen tearing or flickering shadows, GT5 is kind of a mess in this department. As a result, in motion it never really looks as good as it should do, which is a shame. Last time, we discussed how GT4 took a step in making the driving physics feel more realistic and believable, with the trade-off that it doesn't feel as satisfying to play as GT3. I think GT5 strikes a good balance here. Driving feels intuitive, but the cars are still dynamic and move in a natural way. Drifting in particular, albeit not the most realistic, I find a lot of fun, and that's only helped by the ability to now leave thick black streaks of rubber and plumes of tyre smoke. Once again, a wheel is really the ideal way to play this game, but even on a controller it feels good. Being able to now map brake and throttle to the triggers on the DualShock 3 is nice, but you can stick with using the pressure-sensitive face buttons or analog sticks if you prefer. Through the course of this series, I haven't really talked very much about engine sounds. The reason for this is that they've always been serviceable, but not particularly noteworthy, at least compared to other aspects of these games. With GT5, that starts to change, but not for the better. To put it frankly, the engine sounds in this game are, for the most part, terrible. Most cars sound muffled and distorted, and in some cases even downright unpleasant. In many ways, they're actually worse than how they were in the PS2 games, and I'm not entirely sure how they managed that. If you ever wanted to know where the joke of cars in Gran Turismo sounding like vacuum cleaners came from, this is it. As for the in-race soundtrack, I honestly don't have too much to add here. After GT4's eclectic mix of genres and eras, GT5 is a lot more centered around the music that was popular when it came out, mostly indie rock and electronic. It's a good soundtrack. Daiki Kasho once again brings a few new original tunes, and I think they're even better than his stuff from GT4. Bear in mind, if you prefer, you can now also play other songs that you've saved to your PS3, both in the menus and the races. From this point in the series onwards, the games would start becoming more unified, in the sense that they're pretty much the same no matter where you are in the world. No more region-specific cars and soundtracks. One of the only exceptions to this is that in Japan, GT5 has a different intro movie from the rest of the world, featuring, unsurprisingly, Moon over the castle. Everywhere else, following a build-up that shows what goes into actually manufacturing a car, we're greeted by My Chemical Romance's Planetary Go. Now, I'll admit that this is a purely nostalgic choice, but I actually prefer this version simply because for me, it perfectly captures the excitement I had back in 2010, putting the disc in and playing GT5 for the first time. Now, with over 1,000 car models, where do we even start? Well, it's not actually that difficult, as, like I mentioned, most of them are just carryovers from GT4. Sadly, a few of the biggest oddballs didn't make the cut though, like the vintage Benzes, OG Daihatsu Midget, and Nike 1. It's also worth noting that there are a few standard cars here that weren't in GT4, like the Mazda Furai and Bugatti Veyron. These were cars that debuted in GT on the PSP instead, and were simply never remade into full premium models. Speaking of which, the 200 or so premium cars represent a decent mix of noteworthy models that had already appeared in the series, and entirely new ones. Like I said, the addition of exotic brands like Ferrari and Lamborghini was a major coup, but Porsche is still a notable absence thanks to EA's exclusivity deal at the time. Now, whilst there are a number of the latest models represented, what you'll notice is that many of them are capped at 2008 as the most recent. This is particularly noticeable with the WRC and Super GT cars. If you remember, 2008 was the original release estimate of GT5, so this could be the reason why. But we also have to consider the fact that these new PS3 quality models take considerably longer to make than the PS2 ones. This also explains why there are relatively so few, despite the game being in development for at least half a decade. When it comes to the tracks, although I highlighted the fact that some of them are also PS2 carryovers, it's really only a handful, with the vast majority of circuits being of PS3 quality. The selection is solid, with there being a decent number of real and original circuits, both ones that have been seen before and entirely new faces. In terms of new real-world tracks, we have the likes of Daytona, Indianapolis, and Monza, and on the original side, London, Cape Ring, Eiger Nordwand, and more. It's a very decent roster, but I do have one major complaint. Although there are quite a few classic GT courses, like Grand Valley, Special Stage Route 5, etc., not a single original circuit that debuted in GT4 made the cut. If you watched the previous part in this series, you'll know that I rate GT4's original circuits very highly. So, to not see a single one reappear in GT5, or any other game after this, is a little bit heartbreaking. I get that they wanted to focus on their new original circuits, many of which I do also like, but to me it still seems like a waste. Bear in mind that this point does have an asterisk next to it, which we'll get to later. So, what about the single player experience of GT5? With more cars than ever before, that leaves a lot of possibilities on the table. To kick things off, let's go buy our first car. The used dealership once again returns, but not quite in the same way as before. Instead, this is where all of the standard cars are sold, from cheap econo boxes to multi-million credit race cars. In that sense, the same is also true in the premium dealers, although at the 20,000 credit price point, you won't have quite as much choice. Once you've chosen your ride, most likely some sort of compact, as usual, it's time to head over to the Sunday Cup and hit the track. So, despite their general quality, in the first 4 games, the AI was never particularly great. They could give you a decent race, but on the whole, they certainly felt more artificial than intelligent. Well, with the transition to the PlayStation 3, I'm pleased to say that they've finally taken a major step forward in this regard. The AI has a lot more awareness when it comes to other cars. They're now actually capable of avoiding accidents and not just causing them. They do still have a few blind spots here and there, but on the whole, it's a big step up over the PS2 games. However, at the same time, they've also become noticeably slower. I'm not really sure how this happened, but by playing the game normally, I basically never felt challenged by the AI in any way. Only by handicapping myself with a much slower car was I able to have some tougher races, and even then, I still felt like I had the upper hand. The AI have this weird tendency to just kind of give up when you're alongside them, like they're just rolling over and accepting defeat. It's not great, but honestly, I don't think the racing has ever been one of this series' greatest strengths. That's not to say that it doesn't matter, but there are plenty of other ways to enjoy the single player experience. For me, the most important one is just progressing through the game at your own rate. However, here we run into a very interesting design decision in GT5. Every time you complete a race, you earn XP, which increases your driver level. But what does that actually mean? Well, each race event has a minimum level required to enter it. Now on paper, this seems completely unnecessary. The main restriction to your being able to win the tougher events in the first place is having a fast enough car to do so. But that leads us to the second point. Every car also has a level attached to it, and you can only buy cars with an equal or lower level than yourself, even if you have enough credits for something better. Now, I don't think I need to explain why this is such a strange decision that almost goes against the formula that was established all the way back in the first game. Win races, earn money, buy cars, win tougher races, etc. In this gameplay loop, you're only limited by your own ability and the cars you have, not some arbitrary level cap telling you which events you can and can't enter, and which cars you can and can't buy. What it means is that no matter what you do, your progression will always be somewhat linear. All of the prize cars you receive are also balanced around the minimum level of the event, meaning that the completely busted prize cars of the past games are no longer a thing. In fact, in the early game, most of the prize cars kinda suck. What all of this means is that there's far less strategy involved in making your way through this game, as you only have a limited number of options at any one time. I will say that coming back to GT5, this system isn't as restrictive as I worried it might be, at least when doing a casual playthrough. I never felt like I was locked out of an event I wanted to do just because of my level, but there were a couple of cases where I couldn't buy a certain car, which did get frustrating. All in all, the game is actually pretty generous when it comes to handing out XP. You might have noticed that I haven't yet mentioned license tests. They are still in this game, but because of the level system gatekeeping events instead, they're no longer mandatory for progression. Instead, they give you XP for completing them. I actually kinda like this way of doing it, making them optional, but still rewarding you in a way that helps you to progress, beyond just giving you credits. Generally, the tests here are easier than the ones in the previous games, especially the Super License. Each of the 10 tests here are made up of overtaking challenges where you have to reach the front of the pack within a limited amount of time. They remind me a bit of the driving missions in GT4. As a result, this actually makes GT5 Super License by far the easiest one in the entire series. As you can see, the general career mode structure is more of a return to what we saw in GT3, multiple leagues containing several events for different types of cars, all neatly organised in one place. Now on paper, this looks like a lot of content, but the reality is a bit disappointing. Whilst there is a pretty decent selection of events catering to various types of cars, many of them are comprised of just 1 or 2 races, and even in the late game, most of them don't last very long. For example, if I were to tell you about an event called the American Championship in the Extreme League, what would you picture? I, for one, would not imagine an event made of 2 single races that takes not even 15 minutes to beat. And there are more strange decisions here as well. For its relative brevity, in the American Championship you do at least come up against some fairly high-level race cars. However, in the European Championship, which unlocks just 1 level earlier, the opponents are all fairly modest road cars, like the Ford Focus RS and Citroen C5. Then consider this. Outside of the endurance races, the event with the toughest opponent cars is the GT All-Stars Championship. Here you'll encounter top-end prototypes including Group C machines. But where do you find this event? At level 19 in the Expert Series, a whole league below the events we were just talking about. Now with GT4, we discussed how the decision to put the GT World Championship in the Professional League kinda makes the late game feel unbalanced, as most of the events you then unlock in the Extreme League represent a step down in terms of length and difficulty. However, with GT4, I can at least understand what they were trying to do. With GT5, it doesn't really feel like there's any rhyme or reason to these decisions. Why is this event 2 single races, but this one is a 5-race championship? Why are the opponents in this event considerably tougher than the opponents in this one? In the past games, there was always a general structure with how the events would get gradually tougher and longer as you progressed, but with GT5, sometimes it really feels like they just made these decisions by throwing darts at a board. Every time I play through this game, it always irks me, but I really don't think you need to be some sort of series veteran like myself to recognize these problems. I realized I haven't actually mentioned how you beat this game. There are 2 sets of end credits, the first for beating the GT World Championship in the Professional Series, and the second for the Dream Car Championship in the Extreme Series. In a sense, this is sort of like GT3, where you can just ignore completion entirely. If you don't beat these 2 championships, nothing will change, as unlocking events is tied to your driver level, and given that GT All-Stars has tougher opponents, they don't even represent the ultimate challenge within the main career. Up until this point, the single-player career was kind of the end-all and be-all of Gran Turismo. The quality of it almost defined the quality of the game as a whole. But with GT5 bringing so many new features to the series for the first time, including different ways to play, this isn't really true anymore. So why don't we start with the biggest one? Online. A whole decade after it was first teased for the series, online racing was now part of the Gran Turismo experience. The problem with trying to cover this in current day is that the servers went offline in 2014, so I'm mostly relying on my memories from playing it back in the day, as well as old gameplay that other people have recorded. I've always felt that online modes can only be as good as the people who play them, and whilst there were always a few bad eggs, my experiences were generally positive. Whether it be serious racing, casual racing, cruising, track days, drifting, or whatever your niche was, there were always plenty of lobbies filled with people wanting to do the same thing. GT5 was extremely popular, especially at launch, but the absence of any real matchmaking systems meant that you always had to troll through lists of lobbies before finding one you wanted to join. And when you did eventually find one, there was no guarantee that the experience would be good. Although they had GT5 Prologue to test their online systems, the full game was still prone to being unstable in similar ways. Beyond just the racing, we also have to talk about community features. Under this tab, you could find social media elements, with the ability to personalize your page, which could be seen by people on your friends list. You could also leave messages, show off your favorite cars, and even send cars to your friends. This latter feature I remember being very popular, with people gathering in lobbies specifically to trade cars with each other. And of course, no discussion about GT5's online would be complete without mentioning Shuffle Race. This was a feature that randomized cars for each player within a limited pool of options, and it still remains as one of the best ever features in this series. I have so many great Shuffle Race memories from back in the day, and GT5 was the only mainline game it ever appeared in. Of course, playing the game in current day, we can't access this stuff anymore, at least not without a bit of help, but there are still plenty of things we can experience. A course maker really wasn't a necessary feature, but they just had to go and add one anyway. In reality, it's less of a course maker and more a course generator. You can choose from a selection of basic themes, then edit sections of the track by adjusting various parameters using sliders. Functionally, it's pretty basic, but I still get a lot of enjoyment out of seeing what sorts of interesting tracks I can get it to make. I'm not ashamed to admit that I've spent many hours just messing around with it. After you've made your track, you can drive on it in arcade mode, and back when the servers were still up, you could even race them online, which was pretty cool. You know what else is cool? Being able to customize your cars. This is an aspect that was never really explored very much in the previous games, but in response to a certain competitor, GT5 adds some new options. Many premium cars can have unique aero parts fitted, like custom bumpers and wings. It ain't exactly Need for Speed, but it's something. You can also finally repaint your cars, but only through the paint chip system. Basically, every time you buy a car, you receive a token for the paint color it comes in, called the paint chip. This paint chip can then be used to repaint another car or a set of custom wheels. I like this in one sense because it adds to the collection aspect of Gran Turismo, but in practice it can get annoying as you can only use a single paint chip a single time. Back when the servers were still up, you could earn more through the daily login bonus, and this was also true for racing suits and helmets, another new customization option. We also have a feature from the first 2 GT games returning, racing modifications. As cool as it is to see racing mods come back, in this game there are only 17 premium models that actually have one, which kind of defeats the point of the feature. Still, for the few cars that can have it, it's pretty neat. And speaking of returning features, there's a couple from GT4. Photo travel is back for its second appearance with an all-new set of locations. There isn't too much to say beyond that, other than the fact that you can't use any standard cars. I wonder why. B-Spec also returns, but in a slightly different way. Alongside the A-Spec single-player career, there's a B-Spec career that features all of the same events. As before, your B-Spec driver is the one that races, whilst you direct them with general instructions, but there are some new additions. You can create multiple drivers, each with their own set of stats and temperaments that influence how they drive. As a race goes on, they will also gradually lose physical and mental strength, which affects their speed and likeliness to make mistakes. Most races in B-Spec are considerably longer than A-Spec, and unlike GT4, there's no way to accelerate time. This makes them kind of tedious, but given some of the prize cars on offer, they're still worth doing. The best strat is to just give your driver an overpowered car and then let them take care of the rest while you do something else. On paper, this mode is interesting, but in practice, I get bored of it pretty quickly. The fact that the A-Spec and B-Spec careers are now separate also means that you can't use B-Spec to help with endurance races like in GT4, which for me was the best thing about it. Beyond the main career modes, we also have special events. These are uniquely crafted challenges that each focus on a different aspect of the game, whether that be kart racing, NASCAR, rally, or plenty more. To be honest, they're a pretty mixed bag. I enjoy the karts purely because they drive in a very unique way and are fun to race, whereas the rally mode can be a little bit dull, but I just think it's a really cool idea. Here they use the course maker to generate point-to-point stages which are set up like an actual rally. The Grand Tour event is also pretty neat, with its unique cutscenes that really make you feel like you're traveling through Europe. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have stuff like the Top Gear test track. After acquiring the Top Gear license for GT5, it's painfully clear that Polyphony had no idea what to do with it. Having the test track in-game is a neat addition, but racing vintage VWs around it doesn't exactly scream Top Gear to me, and it also isn't very fun. The Sebastian Vettel X Challenge is notable for having you drive the outrageous Red Bull X 2010 fan car, a joint project between Gran Turismo and F1 designer Adrian Newey. It's also notable for being possibly the toughest event in Gran Turismo history. But regardless of how much you enjoy each event here, the rewards you get make them definitely worth doing. Remember how I said that I never found the level system too restrictive? This is part of the reason why. You can earn tons of XP from these events, as well as plenty of cash. And the fact that as you level up you'll gradually unlock more special events always keeps the gameplay varied to some degree. Can you believe that we still have more new features to cover? As mentioned before, car damage was one of, if not the most anticipated feature in GT5, and to be honest, it kinda sucks. Whilst it's possible for some cars to get pretty smashed up, you really have to be trying. In most normal situations, it's barely even noticeable. And visual damage is just one half of the equation. Part of the reason for people wanting damage was so that there would be some consequence if you smashed into stuff, but there just isn't. Whilst GT5 does also have mechanical damage, it isn't used in any GT mode races, and this will become a bit of a trend. Whilst GT5 upped the maximum number of cars on track from 6 to 16, you'll only ever find 12 at most in the career. Why is this? Maybe for performance reasons, but 16 is still possible in arcade mode and even online, so I really don't know. Another new feature is dynamic time and weather. Now, these rain effects weren't especially impressive even at the time, but the ability for conditions to change during the course of a race could add some much needed spice to the gameplay formula. However, once again it's been completely squandered in the career. Through the entire A-Spec mode, there's a grand total of 10 races where dynamic weather is enabled, and 4 of those are enduros. Granted, it's not available for every track, but that's still pretty pathetic. It is very possible to fully play through this game up to the endurance races without seeing rain even once. Also, remember tyre wear and fuel usage? 2 variables from the previous games which could also be used to create unique racing scenarios that kept the game interesting? Well, outside of the endurance series, they don't appear in a single race. When you put all of this together, it leads to a career that, despite not being incredibly long, still finds a way to drag on. With GT3, I talked about how the career didn't have enough gameplay variables to justify its enormous length. Well, GT5 has plenty of variables, but just chooses not to use them. Whilst this game is filled with many new and interesting ideas, the main career isn't part of that. In fact, it's actually regressed. For me, in spite of what this game does well, it all leads to a single player experience which is undoubtedly worse than the games that came before it. Gran Turismo 5 is the second best-selling PS3 title ever, but that doesn't really give us the full story of how this game was received. Once again, this is a Gran Turismo game, so there are certain things that it will always get praised for, like the driving, the visuals, mostly, and the massive selection of cars and tracks. But at the same time, its issues were by far the most glaring of any game in the series at that point. Now, any discussion around the reception of GT5 has to be preceded by acknowledging its massive expectations. For many people, unless this game were a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, it was going to be a disappointment. But this is somewhat a product of Polyphony themselves for keeping people waiting for so long. In spite of how much time it spent in the oven, for a lot of people, GT5 just seemed slightly undercooked. Of course, the standard cars were the best example and the thing that received the most mockery, but it was also let down by performance issues, as well as some of the most hotly anticipated features not really impressing as much as hoped. In current day, the struggles Polyphony faced when developing GT5 have been pretty well documented. The PS3's unique cell processor was the main culprit, as whilst it was extremely powerful by the standards of back then, it was very difficult to use that power effectively. This goes some way to explain the problems with GT5, as on paper it seemed like they would be able to do certain things, but when they actually got around to development, they realised it wasn't quite as simple. Last time, we talked about how the relative stagnation of the series with GT4 opened the door to some potential rivals emerging. Well, if that was the case, the massive time gap between GT4 and GT5 pretty much ushered them right through that door. After its debut on the original Xbox, the Forza Motorsport series went from strength to strength on the 360. Motorsport 2 came out in 2007, and that was followed by FM3 in 2009. So when GT5 came out in 2010, Forza was able to hit back with what was already their third complete game on the console less than a year later. This strategy seemed to work, as FM4 is generally considered the gold standard for simulation racers of this console generation. That's not to say that it dominated GT5 in every way, but it was certainly a much more polished and consistent experience. GT5's general reputation has always been difficult to gauge, as there are those who absolutely adore it, and those who totally despise it. So I was very intrigued to see where it would come out in my fan-voted poll. If we take a look, we can discover that it ended up in second place overall with more than 17% of the total votes. Now, for anyone who is questioning why I bothered with this poll because the results would be obvious anyway, this is why. I did not realise that GT5 was this widely loved, at least among my viewers. Now, there is a slight caveat here with the one-sided nature of the results. GT4 has almost half of the total votes. Although I can't say this for certain, I'm fairly confident that if you were to remove GT4 and redistribute all of its votes across those people's second favourite games, we would most likely see GT2 or GT3 come out on top, just based on what those games do well in a similar vein to GT4. That said, the continued popularity of GT5 cannot be underestimated. There were many reasons for why people chose it, but the most common one I saw, beyond because it was my first GT game, was the general vibe. With this, I'm not just talking about the presentation, although that is part of it, but also what the game actually does. For instance, this game gives you a car on your birthday. It also plays Christmas music around that time of year. These are both things that have been carried through to every GT game since, but it's these sorts of small details that, in spite of its many flaws, made GT5 feel special. It just has so much charm. You can really feel the passion of the people who made it. As such, I think GT5 is the coziest Gran Turismo. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of the people who voted for it would agree with me. Beyond that, my thoughts on this game are still pretty mixed. I have to mention that whilst I did play GT3 and GT4 when they were the current games, I wasn't really old enough to understand their wider impact. They were just fun car games that I liked. But by the time of GT5, I was a lot more involved in the series. I remember watching and re-watching every single trailer, and scouring the web for any new piece of information I could find. I was properly hyped for this game, to a degree I probably never will be for anything ever again. And when it eventually came out, I really enjoyed it. To a point. For me, there was always a lingering disappointment with this game. Not just because it was so highly anticipated that ultimately it was never going to fulfill its expectations, but because it was a letdown in some pretty basic ways. Even back then, I could recognize that the single-player career was not as good as it could have been, and certainly not a match for GT3 or GT4. It feels kind of bad to say this, because GT5 isn't a small game. There's easily hundreds of hours of content here, but I just got the feeling that they could have done way more with what they had. So, not long after, I got an Xbox and defected over to Forza. And having played both when they were new, I can say that FM4 is the better game in my opinion. And if I'm being honest, my opinion of GT5 hasn't really changed that much since all those years ago. One of the quirks of trying to review this game in retrospect is that it isn't exactly the same as how I played it back then. Being an online game, it was gradually updated and even had DLC packs which are no longer accessible. And of course, with the servers long gone, there are certain things within the game itself that can't be accessed. I've already touched on a few of these, but for me, two of the most important features brought in updates were the seasonal events and the online collector's dealership, or OCD, both of which came about a month after the game released. These features helped rectify some pretty major balancing issues with this game. As opposed to previous GT games, where many of the rarest and most valuable cars can be won as prizes, in GT5 they just put them in the dealers for crazy amounts of money, up to 20 million credits in some cases. At the same time, there were many rare cars that were difficult to find as a result of only appearing in the limited rotation of the used dealership, the Formula GT being the most infamous example. Seasonal events not only added more single-player races to the game, but ones with big payouts that made the high-value cars a lot more attainable. The OCD, meanwhile, stocked a rotating supply of the most valuable and desirable cars that could be found in the used dealers. These two features worked hand in hand to make acquiring cars in the post-game much more viable, and thus made GT5 a much more enjoyable experience. But with the servers offline, they don't work anymore, so we're back to square one. When you think about it, it's a pretty stupid situation which shouldn't have existed had they just not designed the game like this in the first place. As such, playing this game in current day just feels hollow, to the point where comparing it with the older ones almost seems unfair, because this isn't GT5 in the form it was meant to be played. Now of course, people have hacked and modded online features back into this game, but that's not my point. In retrospect, the fact that the first Gran Turismo to have online connectivity is also the first where the design of the single player started going noticeably downhill is not a coincidence. With GT5, although he never said it outright, Kaz seemed pretty keen to stress that it would be more than just a racing game. The phrase online car life simulator was thrown about in the marketing as early as 2006, and with the final game you can kind of see what they're getting at with the multitude of new features and online elements. However, this desire for the game to be seen as more than simply just a racing game is not entirely a good thing. In some ways, it's detrimental to the overall game design, because if the people making the game don't think about it as a game, they won't necessarily design it like a game either. This can lead to them making design choices that don't actually make the experience more enjoyable for the player, a point that will become even more evident as the series goes on. But in spite of everything, I still believe that each of these games has something worth playing it for in current day. With GT5, I'm not going to pick any specific feature or area of content, but rather a broader theme: ambition. Gran Turismo 5 was, and still is, the most ambitious game in this series. No matter how flawed or disappointing any singular aspect of it may be, this is still true. I mean, when you think about what was promised with this game, every new feature and improvement, they did deliver on all of it, just maybe not to the standard we all hoped for. If this game were a person, it would be someone who's always eager to please everyone around them, but just can't quite do anything correctly. In spite of their failings, you just can't bring yourself to dislike them because they always have your best interests at heart. That's what I see in this game. It's a people pleaser. For as much as I love the PS2 titles, they didn't really try to evolve the Gran Turismo formula, instead just added a new coat of paint, more content, and some minor tweaks and adjustments. In short, they played it safe by only improving in the areas that they knew would be received well, and that they were already market leaders in, and reaped major rewards because of it. When I came up with the idea for this series of videos, you might have expected that the one I'd be looking forward to making the most was GT3, as it's my personal favourite. But no, it was always GT5. My only frustration is that there is just so much to talk about with this game that I know there's going to be stuff I missed out here. But that speaks to another important point. I think this game is incredibly fascinating, and not just because of what's in it, but also what isn't. This game has an astounding amount of unused and cut content, from unique cars to career mode events, and most famously, tracks. Remember when I said about none of the original circuits from GT4 returning? Well, that was kind of a lie. Many of them did return, but they would only be discovered almost a decade later, hidden in the files. There's even a glitched out version of Pikes Peak from GT2. It's speculated that these were intended for DLC at some point, but it never happened. Honestly, the amount of secrets hidden in this game really makes me wonder what was going on at Polyphony when they were making it. Is there even more that we don't know about? Who's to say? GT5 is the gift that just keeps on giving. Of course, when I talk about ambition, the irony is that the one part of GT5 that isn't really ambitious is the main single-player career. In my opinion, the most important part of a Gran Turismo game. But honestly, who knows what GT5 could have turned out like had the situation been slightly different. Whilst I don't personally consider it an all-time great, unlike its predecessors, GT5 is still a very important game in the story of this franchise. Some love it, others may hate it, but there's no doubt in my mind that it will continue to be discussed, speculated on, and remembered for many more years to come.